Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Welcome in, everyone. Or actually, welcome to you specifically.
Yeah, we're doing things a little bit differently today.
We are. We've got a really fascinating stack of notes on the table today, curated just for you, because when you sent us this material, focusing on Chapter 4 of a short guide to writing about literature, the 12th edition, it was pretty clear you weren't looking for like a basic refresher.
Right, we're not asking what a thesis statement is.
Exactly, or, how to format a bibliography. You already know the landscape. So the mission for this deep dive is to get into the actual mechanics of high-level literary criticism.
And that's a huge leap. It's the transition from being just a casual, competent reader to becoming a sharp critic, someone who can deconstruct a text, form a really strong thesis, and write a persuasive essay.
Which is easier said than done, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's often where even very experienced readers hit a wall, because intuitively understanding a piece of literature is one thing, but translating that intuition into a structured, airtight essay, that is an entirely different cognitive process.
So how are we tackling this today?
Well, we are going to strictly follow the roadmap laid out in the chapter. We'll start with foundational reading principles, specifically explication and analysis. Then we'll move into structuring arguments and comparisons, and we'll finish up with the actual mechanics of drafting and revision.
Perfect. Okay, let's unpack this. We are starting with explication.
Yes, the art of unfolding the text.
Right, because explication literally means unfolding or spreading out. And let's bypass the basic definitions here. We know explication isn't a plot summary.
Right.
And it's not a historical biography of the author's life either.
No, not at all. It is a rigorous, line-by-line commentary. It reveals the meaning of the work by looking at the implications of the words, the rhymes, the structural shifts.
But what really stands out in these notes is the insistence on a very specific physical preamble to the actual writing part.
A transcription exercise.
Yeah. The recommendation is to manually type or write out the entire text you're explicating, double-spaced, before you even begin your commentary.
I know how that sounds.
It sounds, frankly, like busy work. Why introduce that kind of manual friction when you already have the printed text right in front of you?
It sounds totally archaic until you actually try it. The problem with reading a printed text, especially for you, since you probably read constantly, is that your brain is just too efficient.
We skim.
Exactly. We skim. You absorb the holistic meaning of a stanza, and you gloss over the microscopic syntactical choices. So by forcing yourself to manually transcribe the text, you are forcibly slowing down your cognitive processing speed.
You have to interact with it comma by comma.
Comma by comma. And creating that double-spaced copy transforms the text from a polished, finished product into raw, workable material. You literally make physical room to get into it. You have space for annotations, highlighting, bolding, marking rhythmic shifts.
Taking that concept into practice, the notes look at a sample exercise using Langston Hughes's poem, Harlem.
A classic.
We all know the poem. We know the core question, what happens to a dream deferred? And Hughes counts on readers knowing that Harlem is an African-American community. We understand that context.
But the student example provided in the chapter from a writer named Tim Clark, he takes a different approach in his journal notes.
Yeah, he bypasses the historical context entirely to focus strictly on the structural explication. He actually maps the poem as an upside-down building.
Which is brilliant, because when you type that poem out, the visual layout becomes undeniable evidence. The title, Harlem, sits at the top as the foundation. Hughes then drops down into the core question, flush left.
But then the similes that follow are different.
Right. What's fascinating here is the progression of Hughes's comparisons. The dream drying up like a raisin, festering like a sore, stinking like rotten meat. These are all physically indented on the page.
And Clark notes how the language pivots in those indented sections. Hughes introduces something that briefly seems positive, right? The dream crusting over like a syrupy sweet.
But the explication reveals that the sweetness isn't actually a relief.
No, it's a coagulation. It's a scab over a wound. Then it becomes a heavy load. And then the structure shifts again.
It drops the similes entirely. The poem moves back to a flush left alignment, completely isolated by whitespace, and shifts into italics for that final explosive line. Or does it explode?
And the student doesn't just say, hey, the ending is powerful.
No, the explication proves why it's powerful by tracking the physical appearance on the page. The indentations, the single italicized final line, they act as literal evidence for the student's essay.
So for you listening, we have a quick explication checklist. As you read, you need to ask, does the poem imply a story or a change in mood?
Right. What do the connotations of words tell us? Like the difference between using the word dream versus the word hope.
But explication has a very obvious limit, doesn't it?
It really does. It's fantastic for a short poem.
Yeah.
But if you try to explicate a 500-page Victorian novel line by line,
you're going to produce a multi-volume manuscript that absolutely nobody wants to read.
it's way too tedious. It isn't scalable at all.
Which is why we have to shift gears to the second form of criticism, which is analysis.
Exactly. If explication is looking at the molecular structure, analysis is breaking it down to understand the whole. You are deliberately separating a complex work into its parts.
Like looking at character, setting, or meter.
Right, to understand how those specific parts contribute to the overall whole.
The text provides a great sample exercise for this, using the Judgment of Solomon narrative from the book of 1 Kings in the Bible.
It's a perfect example.
And again, enthusiastically recounting this story, we have two harlots who claim the exact same living baby. King Solomon is faced with this impossible dilemma, and he threatens to divide the child in two with a sword to reveal the true mother.
And if we analyze the form of that story, it moves from a problem to a solution. It goes from talk of death and quarreling to life and unity. It's a classic happy ending structure.
But here's where it gets really interesting. When you analyze the characters and the missing elements, the text acts as a pure detective story.
A closed room mystery.
Yes, because the author deliberately makes the two women identical. They are both harlots, they live in the same house.
There are no outside witnesses.
None. No husbands, no extended family. This authorial choice forces Solomon and the reader to judge them solely on their maternal love versus their hard-heartedness.
And the analytical goldmine here is the power of symmetry in the dialogue. The true mother gives up her claim because she loves the child. She cries out, "Give her the living child, and in no wise slay it."
She's essentially saying, let my rival have the baby, just let it live.
Right. But then Solomon uses those exact same words for his final judgment. Give her the living child, and in no wise slay it.
But he changes the meaning.
Yes, he changes the meaning of the pronoun her to mean the true mother. The exact phrase of sacrifice becomes the phrase of justice.
And the key lesson here, analytically, is that the story lacks any explicit editorializing.
Unlike later Bibles that have marginal notes telling you what to think.
Exactly. The original text doesn't pause to give a moral lecture. It proves that a great text allows the reader to draw their own conclusions based entirely on the structural evidence.
Which is exactly what you should aim for in your own writing. Now let's transition from isolating parts of a single text to using comparison as an analytic tool.
The notes introduce this great concept with the quote, if you really want to see something, look at something else.
Comparison is such a powerful tool because it highlights unique features by holding a text up against something similar but significantly different.
But it's also the essay structure that traps the most students.
Oh, the 7-layer cake trap.
Yes. Let's warn you about this right now. Do not write a 7-layer cake essay.
That is when a writer spends 3 pages exhaustively detailing everything about Book A and then spends the next 3 pages exhaustively detailing everything about Book B.
It feels like 2 completely unrelated essays that only vaguely connect in the conclusion.
It forces the reader to do all the work of synthesis. Instead, you have to organize by theme or point by point.
The chapter gives the example of comparing Huck Finn and Holden Caulfield.
Right. So rather than a Huck section and a Holden section, you discuss their quests first. Then in the next section, you compare the corrupt world surrounding them. And finally, you compare their degree of success.
You weave them together constantly.
But there is a golden rule here. You can't just list similarities and differences. You must make a point. You need a thesis.
And you can't compare things that are too different.
Yeah, never. If you try to compare Holden Caulfield and Shakespeare's Macbeth, the subtle differences won't matter because the fundamental differences are just too massive.
Okay, so that brings us to the most intimidating part. Finding a topic and forming a thesis. You are staring at a text, you know you need to say something, but how do you even start?
By asking 2 very specific questions. The first one is, what is this doing?
Meaning, why is this specific scene here? Or why this specific title?
Yes. The notes use Henrik Ibsen's play, Hedda Gabler. She's married, so her name is Hedda Tesman. Why did Ibsen title it Hedda Gabler?
Asking what the title is doing reveals that she identifies more with her powerful father than her husband.
Exactly. The second question you ask to generate ideas is, why do I have this response?
I love this one. Why am I annoyed or amused or puzzled by this character? It treats your own reaction as legitimate, critical data.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, once you ask those questions, you have to gather evidence from the whole text to evaluate your response.
You have to test your thesis.
Right. For example, if you claim that Holden Caulfield hates everything old, you have to remember that he loves old Phoebe, his sister.
You can't just ignore the contradictory evidence to make your essay cleaner.
Never. You organize logically, moving from your lesser points to your most important points to avoid an anticlimax. And when you're communicating your judgments, you have to avoid saying, I feel.
Yes, the notes are ruthless about this. Saying I feel sounds self-absorbed.
It undermines your authority. Instead of just calling a passage forceful or moving, you need to point to the actual evidence in the text that makes it forceful. The evidence does the persuading.
So what does this all mean? We have the tools, we have a thesis. How do we actually apply this and get it on the page?
This brings us to the life cycle of an effective essay: pre-writing, drafting, revising, and editing.
And the notes introduce the concept of the zero draft.
I love the zero draft.
Yeah.
Because it's not even a first draft. It acknowledges that when ideas are in your head, words block each other.
The zero draft is just getting the ideas out of your head and onto the page where one word leads to another. You turn off the internal editor completely.
Once you have that raw material, you move to revising. The best advice: let a day pass. Give yourself distance.
And give your essay a real title, not just On Death of a Salesman. Give it a title with teeth, like A Feminist Reading of Death of a Salesman.
Your opening needs to clearly identify the author, the work, and your thesis. And you have to keep that thesis visible throughout the entire essay with transition words.
Every paragraph has to justify its existence, and then you have to make the conclusion matter.
Don't just hit the brakes. And please, do not say, "Thus we see," and just repeat the thesis verbatim.
Right, it's so anticlimactic. Instead, glance back to the opening. Offer a final piece of evidence, or suggest how your thesis applies to the author's other works. Synthesize it.
And finally, the editing phase. Check your quotes. Proofread meticulously. And remember to use the present tense for literature.
Shakespeare shows, not Shakespeare showed.
Exactly, because the literature is active right now. Remember, the words on the page are the image you present to your reader. If your editing is sloppy, the reader will assume your thinking is sloppy.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We went from typing out a poem for Explication to dissecting a biblical story for analysis.
We talked about avoiding the 7-layer cake trap in comparison essays.
And we worked through finding a topic, getting through the zero draft, and drafting a killer essay.
This raises an important question, though. Something for you to ponder as you approach your own writing. When we follow these rigorous steps of explication and analysis, are we simply uncovering a meaning that the author deliberately hid in the text?
Like an archaeologist digging up a pre-existing structure.
Right. Or are we, as critical readers, actually collaborating with the author to construct an entirely new meaning that didn't even exist before we read it?
Are we excavating the building, or are we helping to build it? That is a phenomenal conceptual space to write from.
It really is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this tutoring session gives you the confidence to tackle your next academic paper with a totally new perspective. Best of luck on your academic journey, and a warm, supportive thank you directly from the Last Minute Lecture team. We will see you next time.